Over the past several videos, we've been looking at using JSON Web Tokens for authentication and authorization. And a very closely associated concept that lots of people have been asking me to go into is the idea of refresh tokens. Because the thing about a JWT is that once you've got hold of it, if somebody has managed to steal it, for example, it entirely of itself can give you access to the web service. And the only limitation on that is that we have that expiration time that in the examples I've been giving you, I'd set to 3 hours. So if somebody does steal it, they've still got a limit on the amount of time they've got access for. And so the shorter we make that expiration time, the more secure we're being, because we'll risk fewer of those problems. The disadvantage of that, however, is if we have a shorter expiration time, then when the web token does expire, you've got to re-enter your credentials or username and password to get a new JWT, and so that's inconvenient. So we've got this compromise between security by making the expiration time short and convenience by making it longer. And the refresh token is a way to help us with that compromise, because what we do, as well as issuing the JWT, the access token, we issue this thing called a refresh token, which has a longer expiry than the JWT. And therefore, when the JWT does expire, rather than having to enter our full credentials to get a new one, we can offer up the refresh token, and that will give us back a new JWT if everything's working okay. Now that may sound like no difference at all. Why not just make the JWT have the longer expiry rather than having this separate refresh token? But it does give us some advantages. It's not perfect, but it makes that compromise better. The first advantage is there are two of them. So even if somebody had stolen your JWT, they haven't got hold of your refresh token, or vice versa, and you need both of them to do the refresh. So when you send off the refresh token, you've also got to have an expired JWT, otherwise both of them won't work without the other. And then the other advantage you've got, which is very different from a JWT, a refresh token can be revoked. So if you know your system is compromised, or simply if you've logged out, you can revoke the refresh token, and therefore even if somebody has it, it'll be rejected because we know they're not allowed to use it. So those are the two big advantages. We'll see a few more as we look at the details of it. So let's dive in, look at the technology of this. I'm going to do this video on what's happening on server side, and then the next video I'll show you what's happening client side. I'm just going to do this in Blazor because that seems to be the most popular one that I've done, but I'm sure you can work out how to do it in Angular and in React. So let's take a look at what we've got. And I've just made a few changes to the existing server. Simply, really, I've just put in some login. So if we look at the authentication controller, you can see I'm just putting a log when we register and if we're successful, and a log when we log in, and that sort of thing. And then also I've put in on the program here, I've put in some logging for the actual authentication. The way we can do this, you can see down here where I had the add JWT bearer and I've got the options in there. The new bit I've done is on these two events, the on challenge, so that's basically if the access fails, you haven't got a valid JWT, and the on token validated, that's what happens when it does. And then you can see I've just called this log attempt, and it just gives us a bit of information. Particularly what it gives us is the current time on the server and the expiration of the token. So I'm just going to do one more thing here, which is actually change the timeout to something rather shorter. So when we do the login, previously we had in this generate JWT, we had add 3 hours, but now I'm just going to change that to adding 30 seconds. So if we go to add seconds and make that 30 seconds, just so we're not waiting around to see the expiry. And so if we run that up, there we can see the swagger that we've got. And also, if we just take a quick look at the console, this is where we'll see those logging messages coming in. I've turned off the other messages just so it's not too messy. And so what we can do here is if I, for example, try to just get the book reviews, then we can see we got that on challenge and there's no JWT present at all because that's not working. But if I were to do my login and use the same old login that we've been using for ages, then we can see it's login called, takes a second or two for the first time, login succeeded, and we've got back our JWT. And as before, I can now pop that into the authorize up here, and that will now be sent off in the header with every request. And so now if I try to get the data, we can see that we've got the token validated. We can see the current time as 9:23:36 and expiration time not long, 923.48. And if we just pop that back and execute again, we can see that it's allowed us to come in there again, but actually something rather odd has happened here, because while I was talking, we actually went beyond the expiration. So the system time is 923.58, but the expiration was 923.48. And the reason for this is because of a concept known as ClockSkew. What you need to bear in mind with this is what I've done is a little bit unusual in that I've got a single server that is both my authentication server, giving the login and that sort of thing, and also is my data server giving me the book reviews. And more commonly, these would be on different machines. You'd have possibly a third-party organization that's doing your authentication for you, and they will give you the JWT that then works on your site. And we can think of that in terms of anything with this authentication controller could be on a different server from the book reviews. But once you've got that, then you get the possibility that the system clocks on the authentication server and your server are not in sync. And so particularly if you've got short expiry times, you've got to have a bit of leeway on the timeout comparing the expiry time to the current time. And that's a thing called ClockSkew. And the default that you get with ASP.NET is a rather large 5 minutes. And so it's advisable to shorten that to some extent. Again, exactly how short you make it, you've got to make decisions on that, but I'm going to shorten it right down to 5 seconds. So if we go into the program, and then here in the options, when we have the token validation parameters, onto that, we can add this ClockSkew and change that to just 5 seconds. So new time span, 0,0,5. And that might be a bit short, but we want to just get things moving along quickly. And so now if we run that up, and once again, let's log in and execute that and get hold of the token, pop it in here, and then let's start accessing the data. Then we can see we got a validated there, and in that case we're within the time limit just. But now if we try that again, we can see we've got the on challenge, which means it's failed, and we can see we're getting the 401 not authorized, and the system time is more than 5 seconds beyond the expiration time. So we've got a very tight time there, and that's going to get very irritating if we have to keep logging on every 30 seconds. Not realistic, but whatever the time may be, we want to have these refresh tokens to make life easier. So let's put that in. So let's go back to the code and stop that. And the first thing to notice about a refresh token that makes it different from a JWT is it does actually require extra storage in the database. So a JWT, remember, once it's been sent to the client sends it back to the server verifies it simply by using the encryption on the JWT. That's the only way it knows that it's correct. It doesn't need to make any reference to a database, which is something that also makes that process faster. But with a refresh token, we do need to put it in a database so that it can be revoked, as we discussed. So let's do that. Let's go to our library user. So remember, this is the data type derived from identity user that actually puts data in the database. And what we're going to add to that is a couple of things. We're going to have a property of type nullable string. So it'll be a nullable column in the database, and we'll just call that refresh token. So that's where the token goes. And then also stored in the database, we're going to have a property of type datetime, which is going to be the refresh token expiry. So unlike the JWT, the expiry is not stored embedded in the token. The token is just a unique ID, and the expiry is looked up in the database. So that's what we've got there. Then we've got to do the work of adding that to the database. So simple enough, we just do our add migration, and we'll call that add refresh token. So we'll let that run, and then we'll do an update database, and that will put that into the database. Not going to bother to check that, believe me, that's in there. Okay, now we've got to make use of that. So what we've now got to do is in the authentication controller, we've got to issue a refresh token as well as a JWT. So let's do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pop into here a private static method that's going to return a string, and it's going to be called generate refresh token. And all the token is going to be is a random number, effectively. So I'm going to say var random number, and we're going to have this initially as an array of bytes. So new byte 64. So that should be big enough. And then I'm going to use not the regular random number generator, just random that you get in the system namespace, because although that's good enough for certain situations like gaming and that sort of thing maybe, it's not regarded as secure. Those random numbers are somewhat predictable. Now, it'd be very difficult to predict them, but it's regarded as a risk. So there is a cryptographic random number generator that is much better at this and much more secure. So we're going to say generator equals, and then we've got this random number generator from cryptography, and that is simply used as a factory to create that. And then once we've got those two, then we can say generator dot get bytes, and then we just put that random number into there, and that will populate it with just this random number. And then finally we want that as a string, so we return, we can do a convert, and then we just want to turn this into base 64 as we've seen before. So that's our random number turned into a string, and that's going to be unique every time. Then we're going to make use of that. So now we need to make sure that that gets returned with the other bits and pieces when we do the login. And so remember, the login returns this login response. So let's alter that so that it's also got the refresh token. So we'll put in here just a prop. It's going to be a required string, and we'll call this refresh token. I might, for the convenience for the end user, also put another one in for the refresh token expiration, just like we've got for the JWT expiration, but that just complicates matters. Sometimes you want to do that, but I'm going to leave it out. Then back in our authentication controller, you can see we're getting an error there. So now what we've got to do is in our login, we've got to use that method I just wrote. So we're going to say var refresh token equals, and then just use that generate refresh token. So that'll give it us back. We've then got to do a couple of things with it. We've got to remember store this in the database. And we just added onto our user object, we had the refresh token, that's what I just put in there. And then also we've got to, on our user object, set the refresh token expiry. And again, we can choose whatever we like. The basic idea is it should be longer than the JWT expiry. What I'm going to do is simply set that to 1 minute. That's a ridiculously short time for real, but it's greater than our 30 seconds. It'll just mean we can demo this more easily. So we'll have UTC-now.add minutes and just add the 1 minute onto there. And then we've got to store that in the database. So we can do that with an await. And then we've already got our user manager, and we just do an update async and then pass in the user that we've altered, so that will be stored in the database. And then finally we've got to pop that into the login response. So if in here we just do the refresh token equals refresh token, and that's that all done. Let's just run that up, see what's happening there. So if we now do our login and execute that, then we can see we're getting back that refresh token, so just the base 64 encoded version of what we had. And if we take a quick look in the database, then here in authenticated library, if we look in the tables, if we look in the user table and scroll over, there we can see on the end, there's the refresh token and there's the expiry that we gave it. And it's probably already out of date because we only gave it a minute, but we can see that that's working. Okay, now we need to start making use of that, and we've got to provide another endpoint on the authentication controller that will actually accept this refresh token and give us back the new JWT. So let's do that next. So what we're going to do is back in here, we're going to put in this new endpoint, and we're going to make this a post for similar reasons to the way we made login a post. So it's another way of logging in really. And so we're going to call this refresh. I'm going to give it a few response types just so that Swagger can give us a nice view of what's going on. So it's going to have unauthorized, it's going to have an internal server error, and it's also going to have, obviously enough, okay, if it succeeds. So that's what we've got there. And then it's going to be a public async. It's going to be a task returning an I action result, and it's going to be called refresh. And the data that comes in is going to be coming in through the body. Because obviously we don't want to send the refresh token in the URI because that's not going to be secure, so it needs to come from the body. And in fact, we need a new type for this. So let's go back to authentication and add in here a new class that we're going to call refresh model. And the refresh model is just going to take a couple of things. As we said, you need two things to do a refresh. You need the refresh token, but you also need the JWT. So we're going to have a required string, and I'll call this access token. That's the JWT, just to distinguish it from refresh token. And then we'll have another one of those that we'll call refresh token. And so that's the data that's going to be sent in when we do a refresh. Back in the controller, that's going to be from body and then refresh model. So that's our data coming in. Just so we can see what's going on, let's log that. So we'll just put in here log information and then simply refresh called. And then what we need to do is find out who it is that's trying to do the refresh. Now you'll notice we have not put an authorize on this because this is for someone who is not authorized because their JWT has expired. So we've got to get who it is, and we get that from the JWT that's passed in. So we're going to have to write a method to do this. And so what I'm going to do is we'll have a private method that returns this idea of a claims principal or not. So we'll make that optional. And then we'll call this get principal from expired token and pass in the token. And then we need to create some token validation parameters so that we can have a look at the internals of this token. And we do that basically by copying the ones that we had in the program. So here we set up these token validation parameters. So we'll start out by copying those, and we'll just in here say var validation equals all of that. Well, at least that's a good starting point. We need to change a few things. One thing is our configuration is no longer coming from the builder. We've already got a configuration injected in there, so we can put that in there and in there. We also need to get hold of our secret, so that again we had here in the program. Again, reading it from the configuration, so we'll put that in there, and we've got the possible error if that goes wrong. But things we don't need, the one thing we don't need here that's really important is we don't want to have the lifetime validator, because the whole point is this is expired. So we don't need the ClockSkew because it's not even going to look at that. We just can say validate lifetime, and then that equals false. Okay, so what that means is it's still going to do the check on the security with the encrypted bit, but it's not going to reject this on the basis of it being expired. It will reject it if anything else is wrong. And so then we need to use that to generate the actual token. So all we now do is we say return and then new JWT security token handler. So this is what's been used internally when we were logging in previously, but now we're doing it explicitly. And we use that to validate the token, and then we pass in the token and the validation parameters that we've just created. And then also that returns the actual security token. So the security token that would have been decomposed from the string version we put in, but actually we're not interested in that, so I'll just put a discard on that because we don't need it. So that's now got all of that working. So that's what we can have, and we can make use of it up here. So we're going to say var principal equals, and then we can have just this get principal from expired token, and we can pass in model dot access token, and that should have got in there. Now we need to check that that's actually worked, that it's given us a valid token. So what we're going to do is say if, and then firstly check whether we had a principal at all, because that could have come back null. Then we're going to see if that has an identity, and then we're going to see if the identity has a name, and then we're going to test whether the name is null. So if any of those have failed, then that whole thing will come out as null. And in that case, we're simply going to bail out. So we're going to do a return unauthorized because something's gone wrong. And as ever, you don't really want to tell your end user anything about what's gone wrong because they may be trying to somehow hack your system. So having done that, we then need to get hold of the actual user object. So we can say var user, and again, we can get this from the user manager, and we can just do a find by name async, and we've already got that name because we just checked that it was there. And let's not forget to await that one. and then want to check firstly that we've got a user at all, because it could be that that's an invalid user still. So if the user is null, then we also want to check that the user's refresh token is the same one as the one that we've just had passed in. So model.refresh token, because those have to match. That's what we're checking to see this is the correct refresh token. And then finally, we need to check that the refresh token hasn't expired. So we need to say or user.refresh token expiry is less than datetime.utc now. So 3 things we're checking. We're checking we've got a user at all, we're checking that that user matches the refresh token that's being handed, and we're checking that the refresh token hasn't expired. Notice again though, we're not getting the expiry from the token like we do with the JWT, we're getting the expiry from the database where we set it up when we logged in. So if any of those fails, again, we're going to return an unauthorized. But if it works, we're now in the position to give them back the JWT. So we can say var and then token equals, we've got this function that we'd already used in the regular login, this generate JWT, and we pass into that simply the username, which again we saw was principal.identity.name. So there's our token, and then the very last thing we have to do, we'll again just log that so that we know that's worked. So if it fails, we'll just see the refresh called and nothing else, because it'll leave on those returns. But if it's succeeded, we'll get this far, and then all we have to do is basically the same that we did with the login. So if we just grab that, put that in there, change that to model.refresh token, because we're just giving them back the same refresh token. Now you don't always do it like this. Sometimes you'll see situations where if you do a refresh, you refresh the refresh token as well as the JWT. So you give yourself a bit more time on the refresh token. Whether that's secure or not, it's up to you to decide. I've decided just to stick with the same one, really, so we can see how it eventually expires. But you could do it by generating a new one with a new time, but we haven't gone for that here. Okay, so that's what we've got there. And that really gives us the basic functionality that we want. So if we now run that up, again, we'll put the two of these side by side so we can see what's going on. And just to prove it's not working to start with, so let's open that and do a try it out. And so the JWT is not present. Now let's go for a login. And so I'll try that one out. Normal sort of thing. Jasper Kent and PA$W0RD. Execute that. Login called, login succeeded. And so we've got back our JWT. So let's make use of that. Got to be fairly quick here because we haven't got long. So we put in bearer and then paste that in there. Authorize, close that, and then back down to the get. And you can see that was fine. So our data's come back because we were within the time limit of 30 seconds. If we hit that again, we're still there. They were getting quite close. Give it a little bit longer because remember we've got the 5-second clock skew as well. Still there. Now it's expired, so now we've got to do the refresh. So if I go to the refresh and try that out, got to be fairly quick here. So the access token I'd already copied, but then I also need to get hold of the refresh token. So that's what we had there. Pass that in there, execute that. We've got the refresh succeeded, and so it's given us back a new JWT. So now if I grab that one and put it into the authorize, so log out with the old one, put in the new one, authorize that, and then we should find back down here that our execute is working again, but only for another 30 seconds. So had to do that pretty fast just because I'd set those limits so short. But you can see in a bigger system, if say your JWT was set for 3 hours and maybe your refresh token was set for 24 hours, that would mean that you could get back in without having to re-enter your credentials, which is probably going to be a safer way to go. There's one last thing I wanted to add on here though, because remember we said one very important thing about a refresh token is it can be revoked, unlike a JWT. So let's pop that one in there as well. So what I want to do is on the authentication controller, I'm going to add a new endpoint for revoke. So let's just steal a little bit of that to make life simpler to start with. and paste that in there. And so first thing is, this is not going to be a post, this is going to be a delete, because we're actually going to be deleting the refresh token from the database. So HTTP delete, we'll call it revoke. Also, I'm going to make this one authorized. So this is something that would be a bit different if we had a separate authentication server from the data server, because you wouldn't actually be logged into the authentication server typically, but we are logged in here, so we can just use authorize. So you're only allowed to do the revoke if you're logged in and you're a valid user. So we've got that. The status code is going to be the same. We'll change that to revoke as well. And then there are going to be no parameters, because we're simply going to revoke for the currently logged on user. So that's what we've got there. Again, we'll start with just a quick log message so we can see where we are. So log information, and we'll just put on there revoke called. And then the first thing we need to do is get hold of the identity of the logged in user. And that's easy enough. We can say var username equals, and then it's available on the HTTP context. So if we get hold of that and look at user.identity, identity may be null, so we'll just put a question mark in there and then get hold of the name. So that will give us the name of the logged in user if there is one. That's the kind of odd thing here. Because we're authorized, we know there must be one, but as far as C# is concerned, identity still could be null, so we've got to put that in there. And then we can put a check for that anyway, so we just put if username is null, then we're going to return unauthorized. And then we're going to, from the username, get hold of the user, so we can say var user equals, and we can say await underscore user manager, and then find by name async, and that's going to take the username that we just got hold of. And then having got hold of the user, again we're going to check that there. So if user is null, and then another return of unauthorized. And then having got to that point, all we now need to do is remove the refresh token. So we say user.refresh token equals null, and then we just need to update that. So another await, and then on the user manager we can say update async and pass in the user. We don't need to do anything with the refresh token expiry, because if we haven't got a refresh token, it's never going to look at that, so we can just leave it like that. So having got that far, we'll do another quick log and just say succeeded. And then only thing we need to return is just OK to say that's worked. No data really to go back. So that's our revoke put together. And so now if we run that up, and again let's compare both the console and the Swagger. And so first thing we'll do is log in. So usual way of doing this, and password. And so we'll execute that. We'll just see the message login called, login succeeded. That gives us back our JWT. Let's take that and use that for our authorization. So bearer, and then paste that in. And we should now see that we've got access to the data there. So if we just look at that, we're getting the data coming back. But now let's call revoke. So all we need to do is go to the revoke that we've got here, that delete, click try it out. Nothing particular to do, we just execute that, and we can see revoke called and revoke succeeded. Now if we try to do a refresh, so let's go in there and try that out. I've already got the JWT, so that one goes in there. But if I scroll back up to the login and get hold of the refresh token and then paste that in there, then we can see that we get back a 401 because we no longer had a refresh token in the database, and therefore it couldn't match anything against the one we passed in. And if we just take a look at the database, so just go into the SQL Server Objects Explorer, have a look in there, just do a quick refresh, and we can see over here on the right, it's still got the old expiry date hanging around, but that doesn't matter. It's the fact that we've got null in there is why it wasn't working. So that was the things we need to do on the server side to start using refresh tokens. So we needed to make sure we've got the extra columns in the database. We've got to generate the refresh token and its expiry date when we do a login, store them in the database, hand back the refresh token, and then we needed a refresh endpoint that accepted both the JWT and the refresh token, and if everything was in order, gave us a new JWT, optionally a new refresh token, but we didn't do that. And then also you need a revoke so that you can remove that. And that means we've now got an explicit way of logging out. So previously we logged out just by throwing away the JWT, but obviously if someone had acquired it, they could still use it. Whereas now we've explicitly logged out, they may be able to use the JWT, but they won't be able to use the refresh token because it's now invalid. Next time, we're going to see how that can all come together because it's quite fiddly doing all that in Swagger. So we're going to add the functionality to a Blazor application and we can see how all that works. So hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do subscribe, do click like, and I'll see you next time.